Sometimes the cruelest joke in a room is the one everyone applauds, right before the truth teaches them all to be silent. The grand ballroom of the Sterling Hope Foundation shimmered beneath crystal chandeliers that scattered warm light across polished marble floors, where the city's wealthiest executives, philanthropists, and celebrities gathered in tailored tuxedos and elegant evening gowns. Waiters moved quietly between round tables dressed in ivory linen, balancing silver trays filled with sparkling water and carefully prepared hors d'oeuvres, while a string quartet filled the air with gentle classical music that seemed almost too refined to notice the ordinary man standing near the entrance. Ethan Brooks adjusted the sleeves of the only suit he owned, one he had worn years earlier at his wife's memorial service and carefully preserved ever since. The fabric no longer fit perfectly, and the cuffs showed faint signs of age, but it had been pressed with care. Beside him stood 8-year-old Lily Brooks in a simple navy blue dress she had insisted was beautiful because her father had picked it. She squeezed his hand and looked around with wide eyes, amazed by the towering floral arrangements and glittering decorations. "Daddy," she whispered softly, "do people really dress like this?" Ethan smiled without taking his eyes off the ballroom. "Sometimes they do, but clothes never tell the whole story." Across the room, cameras flashed as Victoria Sterling entered the gala. At 36, the billionaire CEO had become one of the youngest women ever to lead a Fortune 500 technology company. Every conversation seemed to pause as she crossed the ballroom with effortless confidence, acknowledging donors, board members, and political leaders with practiced grace. She noticed details before anyone else did. She noticed weakness even faster. Near the stage, Charles Bennett, the evening's charismatic master of ceremonies, exchanged amused glances with two event organizers after spotting Ethan reviewing his invitation with a volunteer. "We got an empty seat beside Ms. Sterling," one organizer joked quietly. "Might loosen up the room." Another laughed. "Imagine the headlines tomorrow." None of them expected their harmless little prank to matter. None of them imagined that one seating decision would become the only thing people remembered about the evening. "Mr. Brooks?" the volunteer asked politely. "We've updated your seating assignment." Ethan accepted the new place card without complaint. "Thank you." Lily looked up at him. "Is everything okay?" "Everything's fine, sweetheart." He never asked why. He never questioned whether someone had made a mistake. He simply followed the young volunteer toward the front of the ballroom while hundreds of guests settled into their seats. Quiet conversations began to ripple across nearby tables as people noticed the unexpected pairing. A billionaire CEO seated beside a man whose shoes had clearly been polished by hand instead of replaced. Someone chuckled. Another leaned closer to whisper. A few discreet smiles spread across expensive faces. Victoria glanced toward the chair beside her as Ethan gently pulled it back for Lily before taking his own seat. For the briefest moment, confusion crossed her face, followed by polite restraint. Around them, the whispers grew louder. Ethan heard every one of them. He answered none of them. Instead, he unfolded Lily's napkin, placed it carefully across her lap, and whispered, "Remember what Mom always said. Kind hearts never have to compete." Lily smiled. "I remember." Across the ballroom, several guests laughed again, believing the evening's funniest moment had just begun. None of them realized they were witnessing the first chapter of the story that would leave every voice in that magnificent room searching for words before the night was over. The laughter drifted through the ballroom with practiced elegance, softened by crystal glasses and polished manners, yet unmistakable all the same. Ethan Brooks recognized that kind of laughter because he had heard it before. It was never loud enough to be called cruel, but always quiet enough to leave someone feeling alone. He simply reached for Lily's glass of water and moved it a few inches farther from the edge of the table. "Drink a little," he whispered. "It has been a long drive." Lily smiled and took a careful sip before looking around the room again. "Daddy, do they think we do not belong here?" Ethan considered the question for a moment before answering with the same calm voice that had carried them through every difficult season of their lives. "Some people make decisions with their eyes before they ever use their hearts." We cannot control that. We can only decide who we become. Lily nodded as though she had heard those words many times before, because she had. Across the table, Victoria Sterling quietly observed the exchange without meaning to. She had expected discomfort, perhaps embarrassment, maybe even resentment from the man unexpectedly placed beside her. Instead, she found none of those things. There was only patience, only quiet confidence. The gala host welcomed everyone to the annual charity evening, thanking donors whose names appeared on enormous screens while applause echoed beneath the chandeliers. Every announcement celebrated remarkable generosity measured in millions of dollars. Yet Ethan applauded with exactly the same sincerity as everyone else. He never tried to attract attention. He never looked around to see who might be watching. When an elderly guest several seats away accidentally dropped her evening program, Ethan stood before anyone else reacted. He crossed the narrow space without interrupting the speaker, retrieved the booklet, and handed it back with a warm smile. "Here you are, ma'am." "Thank you, young man," she replied. "You are very kind. I hope someone would do the same for my daughter one day." Ethan answered before quietly returning to his seat. Victoria noticed the woman continue, smiling long after Ethan sat down again. It was the kind of smile that expensive donations could never purchase. Moments later, one of the serving staff lost balance while carrying a tray filled with sparkling water. Several glasses tilted dangerously. Before the young waiter could panic, Ethan gently steadied the edge of the tray with one hand while taking 2 glasses with the other. "You have it," he said softly. "Take your time." The waiter exhaled with relief. "Thank you, sir. I almost ruined the evening." Ethan smiled. "No, you almost had a difficult moment. There is a difference." The waiter quietly laughed before continuing his work. Victoria lowered her eyes toward the table for a brief second. Most guests had barely noticed the incident. Ethan had noticed because he had been paying attention to people instead of appearances. Lily leaned closer to her father. "Mom would have helped too." Ethan looked at her with gentle eyes. She always said that kindness is easiest to give when nobody is keeping score. The orchestra shifted into a softer melody as conversations resumed around the ballroom. Nearby guests who had laughed only minutes earlier gradually stopped whispering. There was nothing entertaining about the man beside the billionaire. In fact, the longer they watched him, the harder it became to fit him into the story they had already decided was true. And for the first time that evening, Victoria Sterling found herself wondering whether the most valuable person in the ballroom had arrived wearing the least expensive suit. Victoria Sterling had built an entire career on reading people within seconds. Investors, competitors, politicians, and entrepreneurs had all learned that she rarely changed her first impression. She believed success left visible fingerprints. Confidence could be heard in a voice. Discipline could be seen in posture. Ambition revealed itself through the smallest decisions. That belief had carried her from a small apartment in Chicago to the corner office of one of the largest technology companies in America before her 37th birthday. It had also quietly convinced her that appearances usually confirmed the truth. Yet the man sitting beside her refused to fit inside any category she understood. Ethan Brooks spoke only when someone addressed him. He never interrupted anyone. He never attempted to impress the executives seated nearby. When board members approached Victoria with business proposals between speeches, Ethan simply turned his attention toward Lily, answering every curious question she asked about the paintings decorating the ballroom walls. "Do you think somebody painted those by hand?" Lily whispered. Ethan studied the artwork for a moment, before smiling. Every masterpiece begins with someone willing to make the first careful brushstroke. Life is not very different. Lily looked at the enormous landscape hanging across the room. "Maybe I will paint something that big someday." "I believe you will," Ethan answered without hesitation. "And if it takes 100 tries, I will still be your biggest fan." Victoria heard every word. There was something unusual about the way Ethan encouraged his daughter. He never promised fame. He never promised fortune. He only promised support. Around the ballroom, conversations increasingly shifted toward quarterly profits, acquisitions, stock performance, and market forecasts. Every discussion sounded polished and important, yet Ethan seemed completely comfortable remaining outside them. Instead, when another waiter passed by carrying a heavy tray, Ethan instinctively stood and opened a narrow path between two crowded chairs so the young employee could pass safely. "Thank you, sir," the waiter said with genuine appreciation. Ethan nodded politely before returning to his seat, as though the gesture required no acknowledgement at all. Victoria found herself watching him instead of the speaker on stage. It bothered her more than she cared to admit. She had spent years surrounded by brilliant people who competed for attention with every sentence. Ethan competed with no one. His confidence seemed untouched by the opinions surrounding him, and that quiet certainty was strangely unfamiliar. During a brief pause before the next presentation, Victoria finally spoke. "Have we met before?" Ethan looked toward her with calm eyes. "I do not believe so. You seem surprisingly comfortable in a room like this." A gentle smile crossed his face. Every room belongs to people before it belongs to titles. The answer lingered in Victoria's mind long after the conversation ended. It was not rehearsed. It was not designed to impress. It simply sounded true. As applause filled the ballroom once again, she noticed something even stranger. Several employees who had quietly crossed paths with Ethan throughout the evening smiled at him with genuine warmth. None reacted to her with the same effortless sincerity despite her reputation and influence. For the first time in many years, Victoria began to question whether she had spent too much of her life measuring success by accomplishments while overlooking the quiet dignity that could never be printed on a business card. And somewhere across the crowded ballroom, an older gentleman had just entered through the side doors, stopped in his tracks after noticing Ethan's face, and stared with an expression that suggested he had recognized someone the rest of the room had completely forgotten. The applause faded as the evening settled into its comfortable rhythm, and the conversations once again drifted toward investment strategies, charitable pledges, and ambitious expansion plans. Crystal glasses caught the golden light, while polished silverware reflected tiny stars across every table. Yet Ethan Brooks seemed far more interested in making sure Lily had finished her dinner than listening to the impressive numbers being announced from the stage. "Did you like the chicken?" he asked quietly. Lily nodded with a bright smile. "It tasted better because we dressed up." Ethan laughed softly. Sometimes special moments make ordinary things feel extraordinary. Victoria Sterling could not explain why she kept listening to their conversations. She had attended hundreds of formal events over the years, sharing tables with governors, inventors, and billionaires, yet very few people spoke with the effortless sincerity of the quiet father beside her. There was no performance in his words, no hidden agenda. Every sentence sounded exactly as though he believed it. A few minutes later, an elderly donor slowly rose from her chair, reaching for her cane before taking a careful step toward the aisle. Without drawing attention to himself, Ethan stood and gently moved his chair aside, creating enough room for her to pass comfortably. "Please take your time," he said with a warm smile. "There is no rush tonight." The woman thanked him with grateful eyes before continuing toward the lobby. Victoria noticed something remarkable. Ethan never looked around afterward to see whether anyone had witnessed the gesture. Kindness, she realized, seemed to be his habit rather than his strategy. Moments later, Lily noticed a young girl standing near the ballroom entrance. She appeared to be the daughter of one of the hotel employees, quietly waiting while her mother finished serving guests. The little girl stared through the doorway at the elegant desserts displayed beneath glass covers, but never stepped inside. Lily gently tugged her father's sleeve. "Daddy, she looks lonely." Ethan followed Lily's gaze and smiled. "Would you like to share your dessert?" Lily answered immediately. "Yes." Ethan nodded proudly. "Then let us ask politely." Together they walked toward the employee, and Ethan spoke with respectful courtesy. "Excuse me. My daughter was wondering whether your little girl would enjoy sharing dessert with her. Only if it is all right with you." The tired mother looked surprised before smiling with quiet appreciation. "That is very thoughtful. Thank you." Within moments, the two little girls were laughing together over slices of chocolate cake, while Ethan and the employee exchanged a few simple words about family, long workdays, and gratitude. Victoria watched the scene unfold from across the room, feeling something inside her shift almost imperceptibly. She had funded children's hospitals, educational programs, and community centers through donations worth millions of dollars. Yet the simple act of one child sharing dessert somehow carried a warmth that no financial report could ever measure. As Ethan and Lily returned to their seats, Lily whispered, "Mom always said happiness grows faster when you give part of it away." Ethan smiled gently. She was right about almost everything. At that very moment, the older gentleman who had entered earlier continued watching Ethan from across the ballroom with growing disbelief. His hands tightened around the program booklet as memories seemed to return one after another. He quietly removed his glasses, looked again, and whispered under his breath, "It cannot be. After all these years, it really is him." No one nearby heard those words, but before the evening ended, that quiet recognition would begin unraveling a story the entire ballroom believed had disappeared forever. The evening had reached the point every organizer anticipated with quiet excitement. The keynote presentation was about to begin, followed by the announcement of the largest charitable commitment in the foundation's history. Guests gradually turned their attention toward the enormous high-definition display stretching across the stage, while photographers adjusted their cameras and technicians exchanged confident nods from the control booth near the back of the ballroom. Charles Bennett stepped to the podium with his familiar smile. "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight your generosity will help shape the future for thousands of families across this country." Warm applause filled the room once again. Victoria Sterling prepared the short remarks she had delivered dozens of times in rehearsal, reviewing a few handwritten notes before placing them neatly beside her water glass. Across the table, Ethan quietly folded Lily's sweater over the back of her chair after noticing the ballroom had grown cooler. "Are you warm enough?" he asked. Lily nodded. "I am fine because you remembered my sweater." Ethan smiled. Good fathers remember little things. Before Lily could answer, the lights above the stage flickered once. Then again, the enormous display behind Charles suddenly froze on a single image before fading into complete darkness. The microphones emitted a brief burst of static before falling silent. The elegant background music disappeared. One by one, every confidence monitor facing the speakers went black. A confused murmur spread across the ballroom. Charles tapped the microphone gently. Nothing. He tried again. Still nothing. Behind the curtains, technicians hurried from one equipment rack to another while whispered instructions grew increasingly urgent. Several guests glanced at their watches. Others reached for their phones. Victoria remained composed on the outside, but years of leading high-profile events had taught her exactly how quickly technical failures could damage donor confidence. She stood and walked briskly toward the stage entrance where the production manager met her with obvious concern. "We have lost communication with the presentation network," he admitted quietly. "The backup system is not responding either." "How long?" Victoria asked. The manager hesitated. "If we cannot isolate the problem, it could take an hour, maybe longer." She looked toward the audience. Hundreds of influential guests waited politely, but patience was already beginning to fade. Months of planning seemed to be slipping away minute by minute. Nearby, Ethan watched the technicians moving with increasing frustration. He did not stare at the dark screen. He watched the people try to solve it. Lily noticed the thoughtful expression on her father's face. "Daddy," she whispered, "something is wrong, is it not?" Ethan nodded almost imperceptibly. "Yes. Can they fix it?" He remained silent for a moment before answering carefully. "I think they are trying very hard." His eyes settled briefly on the equipment rack's position beside the stage. He noticed one technician repeatedly restarting control console while another replaced perfectly functional cables in growing desperation. Ethan recognized a pattern that few people in the ballroom could see. He quietly rose from his chair. Lily looked up at him. "Where are you going?" He smiled gently. Sometimes the fastest way to help is simply to ask whether help is needed. As Ethan began walking toward the stage, the older gentleman across the ballroom suddenly stood as well, His expression filled not with surprise this time, but with unmistakable hope, as though he already knew exactly what was about to happen. The production manager barely looked up as Ethan approached the control area behind the stage. His attention remained fixed on 3 dark monitors and a row of blinking indicator lights that seemed determined to refuse every command. "Sir, I am sorry," the manager said politely without recognizing him. "This area is restricted while we work through the problem." Ethan nodded with complete understanding. "Of course. I only wanted to ask whether there is anything I might be able to do." One of the technicians let out a tired sigh. "Unless you happen to know enterprise presentation networks, synchronized media servers, and integrated control systems. Probably not." Ethan smiled gently, never offended by the remark. "Perhaps I could simply take a look." The technician hesitated before stepping aside with the quiet confidence of someone certain a stranger would find nothing useful. Ethan crouched beside the primary equipment rack, studying the pattern of status lights without touching anything. His eyes moved slowly across the network switches, power distribution modules, and media controllers. He listened more than he looked. A faint rhythmic clicking echoed from somewhere deep inside the cabinet, followed by a brief pause that repeated every few seconds. Ethan closed his eyes for just a moment, as though matching the sound to a memory stored years earlier. He then stood and spoke in the same calm voice he had used all evening. "May I ask one question?" The production manager nodded. "Go ahead." "Did this begin immediately after the backup synchronization completed?" The technicians exchanged surprised glances. "Yes," one answered. "How did you know that?" Ethan pointed toward a small network controller mounted near the bottom of the rack. "The system is repeatedly attempting to recover from a communication conflict. It is protecting itself by refusing to complete the startup sequence." The room grew noticeably quieter. "Can you fix it?" another technician asked. Ethan smiled modestly. "I do not know yet, but I think I know where to begin." With permission from the production manager, he carefully accessed the control console and reviewed a series of diagnostic messages. His hands moved without hesitation, never rushing, never showing off. He disabled one automatic process, restored another, then calmly verified each connection before restarting the synchronization sequence in a different order. The clicking disappeared. A single green indicator illuminated. Then another. Seconds later, every monitor flickered back to life. The massive display behind the stage glowed brilliantly as the Foundation logo returned to the screen. Soft orchestral music flowed once again through the ballroom speakers. The microphones awakened with a gentle tone. Across the ballroom, conversations stopped almost instantly as guests turned toward the stage in visible relief. Charles Bennett tested the microphone. "Well, I believe we are back." Warm applause broke out among the audience, many assuming the technical staff had solved the crisis. Ethan quietly stepped away from the console, prepared to return unnoticed to Lily before anyone had time to thank him. But the older gentleman who had been watching from across the room suddenly walked forward with tears beginning to gather in his eyes. He stared at Ethan for several long seconds before speaking just loudly enough for Victoria, Sterling, and the nearby technicians to hear. "I knew it," he whispered with quiet amazement. "There's only one engineer I have ever met who could diagnose that system simply by listening to it breathe. Ethan Brooks, after all these years, you finally came back." The ballroom remained unusually quiet as the older gentleman stepped closer, his eyes never leaving Ethan Brooks. The technicians looked from one man to the other, uncertain whether they were witnessing an ordinary reunion or the beginning of a story they had somehow missed. Victoria Sterling folded the notes in her hand without realizing she had stopped preparing for her speech altogether. "You know him?" she asked. The gentleman smiled with the kind of respect that only time could earn. "Know him? 20 years ago, everyone in our industry knew him." He extended his hand toward Ethan. "I am Daniel Whitmore. I doubt you remember me." Ethan accepted the handshake with genuine warmth. "Of course I remember you. You were always the one asking the difficult questions." Daniel laughed softly. "And you always had the answers." Several nearby guests drifted closer, their curiosity overcoming their conversations. One technician finally spoke. "Who exactly is he?" Daniel looked around the room before answering carefully. Years ago, when integrated event automation was still considered impossible for venues this size, one engineer changed the entire approach. He designed systems that could predict failures before they happened, synchronize thousands of devices at once, and recover without interrupting live events. Many of the technologies we rely on today began with ideas he developed. The technician stared at Ethan with open disbelief. Victoria looked back at the equipment rack he had repaired in only a few minutes. Suddenly, it made perfect sense. "If that is true," she asked quietly, "why have I never heard his name?" Daniel's smile slowly faded, because he never cared whether anyone remembered it. Ethan lowered his eyes for a brief moment. Daniel gently raised one hand. "Please forgive me, but they deserve to know." Ethan remained silent. Daniel continued in the same calm voice. Several companies offered him fortunes for his work. He could have built one of the largest technology firms in the country. Instead, he sold nearly everything he owned when his wife became seriously ill. Every patent, every ownership stake, every opportunity. He chose more time with his family instead of more money. No one interrupted him. Even the waiters had quietly stopped walking. Daniel glanced toward Lily, who was now standing proudly beside her father. After his wife passed away, he disappeared from the industry. Not because he failed, because he decided that raising his daughter mattered more than chasing another headline. Victoria felt an unfamiliar weight settle in her heart. She remembered the worn suit, the polished shoes, the quiet smile that never asked for recognition. She had mistaken sacrifice for failure. She had confused humility with weakness. Ethan finally spoke, almost apologetically. "There are many brilliant engineers now. The world moved forward." Daniel shook his head. "The world moved because people like you pushed it forward first." Lily slipped her small hand into her father's. "Daddy never talks about those things," she said innocently. "He says the best thing he ever built was our home." Several guests lowered their eyes. Those words carried more power than any presentation prepared for the evening. Victoria looked at Ethan differently now. She no longer saw the man who had been seated beside her as part of an unfortunate joke. She saw a father whose greatest achievement could not be measured by wealth, titles, or awards. And as the foundation's chairman, Margaret Holloway slowly approached after hearing every word from just beyond the stage curtain. The expression on her face made one truth unmistakably clear. Daniel had revealed only the first chapter of a story that was even greater than anyone in the ballroom had imagined. Margaret Holloway walked toward Ethan with slow, deliberate steps, and the quiet conversations that had filled the ballroom faded almost completely. As chairwoman of the Sterling Hope Foundation, her voice carried unusual weight, yet when she finally stood before him, she smiled not as a powerful executive, but as someone greeting an old friend. "I hoped I was not mistaken," she said softly. "It really is you." Ethan offered a respectful nod. "It has been a long time, Margaret." She looked at him for several moments before turning toward the guests who had gradually gathered around them. Many years ago, before this foundation became one of the largest charitable organizations in the country, we nearly lost the community center that started everything. We had no resources, failing equipment, and no way to continue serving the families who depended on us. The room grew still. One young engineer volunteered to rebuild our entire technology system without accepting a single dollar. He worked nights after finishing his regular job because he believed children deserved better opportunities than he had growing up. She looked back at Ethan with unmistakable gratitude. That engineer was Ethan Brooks. Several guests exchanged astonished glances. Margaret continued. "When we insisted on paying him, he refused. He simply asked us to spend the money on books, computers, and scholarships instead." Victoria Sterling lowered her eyes. She had reviewed years of foundation reports before accepting her invitation to serve on the board, yet she had never noticed the name of the quiet man, standing only a few feet away. Not because it had been erased, but because Ethan had requested that every public acknowledgement be removed. "Why?" she asked almost in a whisper. Ethan answered with the same calm sincerity that had defined every word he had spoken that evening. If kindness becomes a transaction, it loses part of its purpose. The children needed the help. They did not need my name. The simplicity of his answer settled over the ballroom like gentle rain. No one found words immediately. No one reached for applause. They simply listened. Margaret smiled warmly. There is one more thing everyone should know. She turned toward the enormous screen behind the stage. With a quiet instruction to the technical team, an old photograph appeared. It showed a much younger Ethan wearing jeans, safety glasses, and a faded work shirt while helping children install their first computer lab. There was no ribbon cutting, no photographers, no reporters. Just laughter on the faces of children who had believed someone cared enough to show up. Lily looked up at the screen with wide eyes. "Daddy, that is you." Ethan smiled. "Yes, sweetheart. That was a long time ago." Lily gently squeezed his hand. "You still help people the same way." Ethan looked at his daughter with quiet pride. "I hope I always will." Victoria slowly stood from her chair. Every eye followed her movement. Without saying a word, she walked to the empty seat beside Ethan, lifted the place card that had originally been assigned there as part of an unfortunate joke, and carefully set it aside. Then she sat beside him once more, this time by her own choice. There was no announcement, no dramatic speech, only a simple act of respect that everyone in the ballroom immediately understood. One by one, conversations disappeared entirely until the magnificent room that had once echoed with quiet laughter became filled with something far more powerful. Complete and reverent silence. For several long moments, no one moved. The silence inside the ballroom felt different now. It was no longer the silence of uncertainty, but the silence that appears when pride quietly steps aside to make room for respect. Victoria Sterling looked at Ethan Brooks before speaking, her confident voice softened by genuine humility. "Mr. Brooks," she said, "I owe you an apology." Ethan turned toward her with the same calm expression he had carried throughout the evening. "There is no need." She gently shook her head. "There is every need. I allowed myself to form an opinion. Before I knew your story, I saw your suit before I saw your character. That is a mistake I intend never to repeat." Ethan smiled kindly. "We all see more clearly after we choose to look." Those simple words carried no resentment, only grace, and somehow that made them even more powerful. Around the ballroom, guests slowly rose from their seats, not because anyone instructed them to do so, but because gratitude seemed like the only appropriate response. There were no dramatic cheers, no celebración. Just hundreds of people standing together in quiet admiration for a man who had never asked to be noticed. Lily looked around the room with wide eyes before tugging gently on her father's sleeve. "Daddy," she whispered, "why is everybody standing?" Ethan knelt beside her chair until they were face to face. "They're not standing for me, sweetheart. They're standing for what kindness can do when people finally recognize it." Lily smiled. Mom would have liked that answer. Ethan's eyes warmed. Yes, I think she would have. Margaret Holloway stepped back to the podium and spoke without looking at her prepared remarks. "Tonight we planned to celebrate generosity measured in dollars. Instead, we have been reminded that the greatest gifts are often measured in quiet choices, faithful hearts, and second chances." Gentle applause followed, respectful rather than triumphant. As the evening drew to a close, guests began leaving the ballroom, but many paused to shake Ethan's hand, introducing themselves not with business cards or titles, but with sincere gratitude. The young waiter Ethan had helped earlier thanked him once more. The elderly donor smiled warmly as she wished Lily a bright future. Even the technicians gathered briefly to ask thoughtful questions, and Ethan answered everyone with patience, encouraging them to keep learning and never stop being curious. Outside, the cool evening air carried the peaceful sounds of the city as Ethan and Lily walked toward the parking lot beneath a sky filled with quiet stars. Their aging sedan waited exactly where Ethan had parked it hours earlier, unchanged by everything that had happened inside the Grand Hotel. Victoria stepped outside just before they reached the car. She hesitated for a moment before walking toward them. "Lily," she asked gently, "would it be all right if I sat beside your father again someday, perhaps somewhere without cameras or speeches. Lily looked at Ethan first. He smiled and gave a small nod. She turned back to Victoria with a bright grin. "I think you would like that." Victoria laughed softly for the first time that evening. Ethan opened the passenger door for Lily before looking back at the magnificent hotel glowing behind them. Nothing about his life had suddenly become richer, yet somehow everything felt lighter. As he started the engine and quietly drove into the night, the lights of the Gala slowly disappeared in the rearview mirror, leaving behind a room full of people who would forever remember that true wealth is never announced by applause, but revealed through quiet dignity, enduring grace, and the courage to choose kindness even when no one is watching.